Hello, my name is Vincent, and welcome. In this episode, let's paint our first ever High Elf Warmaster figurine here at Bunker 6. Here we go, our first Warmaster model, and because this is Warmaster, everything is going to be made of cast metal. And normally these models are attached to plastic bases, so we're going to skewer at the bottom of the bases to create a little bit more grip between the two surfaces. Now we're actually going to prepare our plastic base. I'm just adding some masking tape around the rim of the base, as we're going to be adding a texture paste to the top of the base to fill in the holes that are normally meant for infantry pieces, as we're not going to require those. Now, I could have kept things really old school and used a square base, but I'm not particularly a big fan of the square bases. The rest of the infantry models are normally presented on rectangular bases that are pretty hard to find on eBay these days. But if you are looking for some of these circular bases, you will be able to find them at Vanguard Miniatures. I will leave a link in the description. And as you can see here, I'm just using a very rudimental sculpting tool that you can pick up off Amazon or eBay. These generally come in sets, and they have different ends on each end. And this is a sculpting knife that's not too sharp, and I'm just basically scraping away the excess and making sure that all of the paste is going into the holes, and then I will sand off any of the excess material off camera, so we can now get to gluing the model to the plastic base itself. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You can actually add the model first and then put the texture paste around the glued model to the base to actually create a little bit more texture if you want, but I wasn't sure about doing that because I've got a very thick glue that I'm going to be using here instead to create the texture with the glue and the mixture of sand and small rocks. But as I said, if you want to make the texture more extreme, just keep on adding the texture paste around the model itself. Now, funnily enough, this is actually going to be the most complicated model we've done in terms of basing on the channel. I know that's not saying much, but we're not just going to be doing a typical basing of mixed sand like you're seeing here. We're actually going to be doing additional layers of flocking later on in the video to really make the model feel like it's part of the Warmaster universe. The tape is going to be doing a really good job here because I don't want to be having to scrape off any of the super glue mixed with the grit or mixed sand later on. Now let's move on to the priming. It's very simple. We're going to be using a Vallejo grey primer instead of black because we're going to be painting this model in whites and blues, so I didn't want to start off too dark. Now we're doing a base coat of Ulthuan grey, which is a lovely colour. It is a nice mid-range colour to start with if you're working in whites. The bluey hue to it is really nice because you can punch up with brilliant whites quite easily from it, and you can do the shadows with a nice darker blue. They complement each other very well with this bluey grey mid-tone that is Ulthuan grey. Now, although the pigment coverage is terrible with these paints, please don't use your expensive paints for basing. I'm just using Liquitex here. Now, I do the base coat here with Macragge blue, but I don't do this in all of the blue areas, only at the lowest part of the model, because this is where the darkest parts of the model are going to be. Otherwise, if I just went straight with the Vallejo turquoises that I'm going to be using as my main blue over the white, it's going to be way too bright in my opinion. So I just did this Macragge on the very bottom of the model. It's just to bring the tones down a little bit when I do eventually hit it with the Vallejo turquoises. And here we are, we're starting with our first Vallejo Andrea Blue. It's a lovely colour, very flat and very, very smooth finish to this paint. That can be said for a lot of the Vallejo ranges. They're just not as sticky and as thick, which some people might prefer for the GW range, but I quite like the additional ability to be able to get the paint around without having to water it down so much prior to using it, unlike the GW range. Now, initially I was going to do the regular sort of Space Marines pattern with the blue paint here, but I actually found a lot of the reference images had a much more turquoise finish to it. And I actually had a previous job that required me using a lot of the Vallejo turquoise range, so I ended up using the turquoise paints here from Vallejo. We will actually be bringing everything back with a blue shade to make it feel a little less turquoise, but from looking at the High Elf imagery that I found online, it is much more in the vein of turquoise rather than an ultramarine blue. Now here I'm just adding a recess wash to the base coat because of course the model is not dark like it would have been if it had been primed in black, but as I said before, the majority of this model is going to be quite bright, so we're just adding this black wash to the areas that will require a black recess wash so we don't have to do it later. This is of course where the metallics are going to be, so now all I have to do is work around those recesses and I don't have to add the wash later. Now I'm going back to the blue here because I was toing and froing on whether I wanted to do them in brown leather or match the rest of the blue fabrics across the model. I decided, because the high elves are quite theatrical, that I would continue on with the Andrea blue here for the reins, and I'm quite happy I did, because I think if I had too much brown at the front of the model, things would have started getting dark, and I didn't really want that. Now, I could have painted these additional leather parts in the Andrea blue as well, but I wanted to emphasize the heaviness of the chainmail, and so I thought keeping this like a leather strap kind of suggested that we've got this very heavy chainmail around the legs, and this leather is trying its best to hold it up around the horse's legs and shoulders. Now we're moving on to the metallics here, and I can't recommend enough the metal color range by Vallejo. It is incredible. It's a bit weird because it's obviously meant to go straight into an airbrush. It is nowhere near as thick as any of the metallics that you would imagine from other paint ranges. Because it's meant to be in an airbrush, it comes out like water, but my goodness, the coverage is incredible considering how thin the consistency of the paint is. Highly recommend this paint. Now, I had a lot of trouble filming this episode because I forgot that I had a macro adapter on my lens because I'm an idiot. But you'll see that there's certain things that haven't been spoken about in this video, and you might be like, well, actually I can see that additional work has been done here. And for example, that would be the case where I've done some black outlining around all of the areas that I've been working on so far. That's just to create definition and to remind me that I really need to focus on creating these black lines later on as well, so I don't forget. The black lines are just supposed to really create contrast and definition between the different areas of the model. This is really important considering how small the model is. Now, if I was using a black primer and black base coat, I wouldn't have had to have done this process. I could have just actually painted around the recesses, which would have stayed black. But a lot of the time the paint can get quite chunky because of all the layers you have to do to build up from that black again. So I avoided that, and I'm doing it the longer way by actually going in and doing those black lines afterwards instead. Now, I didn't want the model to be completely white, so I did some greys on the front and the back of the horse with its tail and its mane. We're now going to be going into the tail and the main areas, and we're actually going to be doing some null washing just so it goes into all these lovely sculpted recesses, just to emphasize all of the loose hairs on the horse. And seems as I had the null oil out, I decided to also do a recess wash on the chainmail too. Now, as I previously mentioned, I didn't want everything to feel too turquoise, as from the reference images, although things were turquoise, the shade seemed to go into a darker blue rather than a deep greeny turquoise. So that's why I've used Dragonhorth blue here, and it's a nice, thick, dark, bluey black wash. It's quite oily, so I really put a lot on my brush and just made sure it went into all those recesses pretty thickly. And so we've got some nice deep fabric shadows that we can work up from now, going back to our original Andrea blue, and then we're going to be moving up to even brighter flash highlights later on. As we've found our darkest point and our midtone point, all we really have to do is go in the opposite direction now to start creating the contrast. You'll also notice that I have painted the helmet and done the base coat area of the elf's face. That was pretty simple, just the metallic that I've been using for everything else, the metal color steel, and then hitting it with basic skin tone from Vallejo model color as well. The final step for the elven skin tone is addressed later on in the video, where we add a Games Workshop wash. But for now, we're just adding these midtones and lighter highlights to the blue cloth using Vallejo's deep sky blue and sky blue. Andrea blue, deep sky blue, and sky blue really complement each other really well, and they are the triple threat, I think, in nailing this particular tone of blue for the high elves. One thing that I really like about these highly textured parts of cloth, where it looks like they're sweeping in the wind, is that you don't have to do too much glazing. You can really just paint things onto the model directly without having to get too bogged down in glazing land. Basically, we have the mid-tone, then we hit it with the wash, and then we can just make sure that the areas that we highlight become smaller and smaller, the brighter and brighter we go. It's a pretty simple formula. The only part of the model that required blue glazing was the shield, because it's a large flat surface, or large considering the scale of the model, and so we just did that pretty simply with about 4 glazes, going from the dark blue of Drakenhof all the way up to the sky blue in the corner right of the shield. Now, I might be wrong on this, but it seems that elven runes aren't exactly what I thought they were initially, which was some type of regiment marking or something like that. They're actually sort of mottos or statements of intent that the elves live by, which I think is quite nice. So theoretically, you can add any type of elven rune that you can find online to any of the models you want. So that's what I've done here. And here is the aforementioned shot showing the skin tone and what you would need to paint it. We'll be painting the shade for it next. And all we're doing is loading up the brush with some Reichland Flesh Shade and just getting it into the cavities of this face area. There's some really good deep recesses on this face sculpt, so the shade should sit in there quite nicely. I ended up trying to use Nuln Oil as a glaze to get my white into a more grey and black tone. It worked quite well, you just have to damp off the brush quite a lot so you don't get any watermarks. And if you do, just go back the other way with a lighter tone like I'm doing here with my white paint. And just make sure you really take your time. You don't want to put too much paint on your brush. You basically barely want to see any paint. It's all about gradual layers. It took me quite a while to get confident with glazing, and I'm still miles away. I couldn't do any of this sort of stuff on a larger model, but at this scale, glazing is quite a good thing to do and an easy thing to learn because you don't have too much surface to cover. And I'm just doing some cleanup on the rear end of the horse as well. And as you can see, I'm trying to keep the greys and blacks towards the leather band area and pulling the white layers up to the top of the horse's rear end, so you get this nice soft contrast between the two tones. Let's focus our attention to the staff or banner area of the figurine now. I'm basically copying the same process I was doing with the other blue layers earlier, starting with Andrea blue, then moving into deep sky blue, and then finishing off with sky blue. And if I'm feeling really fancy, I'll throw a little bit of Orthwine grey mixed in with that layer of sky blue just to get a little bit of flash highlighting going in a few select places. Now, aside from the blue highlights, we of course need to have our blue shade, and once again we're reverting back to our Drakenhof Nightshade here, making sure that we pull the wash down towards the center of the banner, towards the eagle sort of statue in the middle of the banner, so you have the lighter areas on the outside of the staff and the darker areas towards the center. Now, you'll want to make sure that you start your glazing sort of in the middle part of where you want to paint and pull down to where you want the darkest point to be. And in order to make it more intense, you reduce that distance by which you pull the paint down. So you want to start off in the middle, then work your way closer and closer to the darkest point with each new glaze. That's kind of how I work anyway. Now, theoretically, this black line work that I'm doing should be a pin wash, but because the model is not being varnished or anything like that, and I'm not using oil paints, I'm just doing it the old-fashioned way with regular black paint. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it's best to stay as tidy as you can throughout the entire process rather than trying to fix things later on. If you see a problem, fix it immediately and don't wait on it. So we're just doing some tidy up here where the black has got out of where it should be with some Orthwine grey. Now I've got the basic structure down of how I want this staff to look, we're just now getting into the finer details with the blue highlights. The lighter you go, the smaller of the surface area you are trying to cover. So, as you can see, I'm starting with the first highlight from the middle of the banner and moving outwards, and I'll reduce that every time I go brighter. Unless I'm doing some edge highlighting, which I'm doing here, where I will only need to focus my attention on certain corners. I don't like to do edge highlighting across every edge, I think it looks a bit too unrealistic, so we're just focusing on areas that I think are suitable for the edge highlighting. Now we're working on the mane and tail highlights here. Very simple, just dragging the edge of the brush upwards just to create an additional layer of texture and tone to the hair. And what can happen is the paint can actually end up in the recesses where you don't want it, so just go back in either with some Nuln Oil or some black paint just to fix that issue. I decided to paint the bird in the middle of the staff a gold because it's a nice eye-catching color and draws your eye to the middle of the model. I think it really holds everything together quite nicely. And it's pretty simple. We're just going to start off with Gehenna's gold here and then add a shade and a very, very subtle highlight later on. Now initially I was going to paint the leather gloves and the leather boots of the elven soldier a lighter brown, I think a scrag brown or Mournfang brown, but I decided to actually go with Rhinox hide because I wanted there to be more contrast when I went up to lighter browns on the leather parts. I decided to then go back to the gold eagle and give it a good wash of Seraphim sepia. It's a nice reddish tone, and then I'll be finishing it off with a gold highlight. Then I moved on to doing some brown highlighting. It's a very similar process to how I did the blue fabric. You just want to make sure that the areas which are brightest are the smallest, and you're pulling all of the lighter color paints away from the dark areas and making sure that you're making these gradations slowly and subtly, and making sure that your glazing is on top form, because you don't want to make things look too choppy, otherwise the gradient won't work. And in this painting tutorial, I found my favorite silver highlight paint yet. This is Chainmail Silver by Vallejo, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's from the game color range, not the model color range. And it might just be bad luck on my part, but I've dealt with a lot of bright silver colors before in the past that have either been too flaky or too thin. But the consistency of this paint is absolutely perfect for what I need it for. And the yellow part here, which is the fabric sort of waving away from the staff, is being painted in my usual Imperial Fist style, but the quick version, and the quick version is basically Avalan Sunset, followed with a Cassandara yellow wash, and then the usual suspects show up for highlighting: Flash Gets yellow, Uriel yellow, and so on. But while that base coat of Avalan Sunset was drying, I decided to go back and finally finish the eagle with a gold highlight of Elven Gold by Scale Color 75. And I like to always make sure I look at the model, take a step away from the painting process for a minute, and just check everything out and make sure that everything is looking as tidy as it possibly can do, and keep an eye out for any mistakes and fix them before we move on to the next stage. I then moved on to shading the cloak, which I wasn't particularly looking forward to, but thankfully the glazing went quite well without too many watermarks, but they were fixed with Hawthorn Grey if there were any in the first place. After painting the red jewel base coat, I then moved on to shading the Avalan Sunset yellow with the Cassandara yellow wash. It's quite orangey, but your eye gets taken away from that when you start adding the highlights in the Avalan Sunset areas. I could have gone with Agrax Earthshade, but I think that would have been a bit too dirty and a bit too brown, so we went with the orangey version instead, and it turned out just fine. And if neither of those sound appealing to you, you can use a diluted version of Scribe Brown. It makes a nice halfway point between Agrax and Cassandara Yellow. Once we've got that layer out of the way, we'll move on to finer and smaller highlights with Flash Gets Yellow and start mixing in little bits of white for some very exceptionally bright flash points that you want to focus on the corners and edges of the areas you intend to be the brightest. My apologies for this next bit not all being in focus, but this is the hair of the elf that I painted in Steel Legion Drab, and now I'm just giving it a quick wash with Agrax Earthshade, and we'll go in and highlight it later with Pale Sand by Vallejo. Now, it's the first time I tried anything like this with my basing, but I went absolutely crazy with my wood glue because I think at the time I was assuming, well, it's going to dry clear, so I didn't have too much to worry about. And I kind of did a few things in the wrong order. I would have probably put the flock down before I put my finer strands of grass down, but you can see what I ended up doing here anyway. These are the colored sponge parts to make sort of little small bushes, and then I ended up adding my grass strands, and then I had to add the flock in manually because there wasn't really any glue that I could reach anymore, which was kind of annoying, but it looks fine once it's all dried, I promise. And we really future-proofed ourselves with keeping that rim clean by using the masking tape, so we haven't had any issues with any of the glue, from the super glue to the wood glue to the sand to the flock. We can take that masking tape off now and get straight to painting the rim without any issues whatsoever. If you're seeing parts of the model that were not painted on camera, just know that every single color has been explained in detail. All I would say is when it comes to the Hawthorn Grey, all you need to do is add a highlight of any white that you like. I used Bold Titanium White by Acryl Pro, but you can use anything you like. The model is finished, and it was so finished that the wood glue hadn't even dried on the bottom. That's why you're seeing some white pooling there in the base area, but not too much to worry as it did eventually dry clear. Now you'll also notice I added some additional foliage which I added with super glue because wood glue would have taken too long to dry. The jewel also was finished off camera with a Rhinox hide layer added in the top left corner and a slight outline of yellows and oranges in the bottom right corner. A dot of white paint was added in the top left corner at the end. If you made made it this far through the video, thank you so much for watching until the end, it's really appreciated. If you enjoy this sort of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you enjoyed the episode, please also consider giving it a thumbs up, and have a peruse around some of the other videos that I've got. It's all Games Workshop Specialist Games goodness. Now, I'm not sure what I'm going to be painting next, but it looks like it's going to be Eldar most likely. I want every episode to be different from the last in terms of army, and even potentially in terms of which specialist games we focus on. So, if you enjoyed that, thank you, and as always, I'm Vincent, and until next time, I'm signing off from here at Bunker 6.